welcome to my audio short story channel. Today's story is Mr. Wendell's Jesus. If you are a parent with young children and you've been sharing these stories with them, this is one story that I encourage you to listen to first because it does involve some childhood trauma. Here's the synopsis. When a traumatic childhood memory surfaces in Ava's life, her neighbor, old Mr. Wendell, is there to help her face her past and her weaknesses. Enjoy the story. I'll see you at the end, and tune in next week when I share insights about today's story. Mr. Wendell's Jesus, a short story by Janet Keller Richards. Copyright 2023, all rights reserved. I climbed the stairs to my duplex and juggled the folders in my arms so I could grab my house key. As usual, my elderly neighbor was sitting on his side of our shared porch. I've known him for a year now, and though at first I wasn't too sure about him, I'm convinced he's a good guy. He's sort of like a grandfather and a sage and a teddy bear all rolled into one. And since my family lives 4 states away from me, it's kind of nice to have him next door. I smiled at him. "Hi, Mr. Wendell. How are you this evening?" Holding his signature glass of lemonade that he makes from real lemons, Mr. Wendell smiled a warm teddy bear smile and said, "Well, Ava, I am just fine. How was your day at the office?" "The usual," I said briefly. Mr. Wendell pointed at the folders I was holding. "And I see you have work to do again this evening." "It's the bane of my existence," I answered with a frown. I liked my work as a human resources associate, but I unequivocally detested having to bring work home with me, and unfortunately, it was happening far too often. "That's too bad," he said. "After sitting in an office all day, you need to be out in that flower garden of yours playing in the dirt." "I would love that, but not tonight," I answered with regret. Mr. Wendell and I both love gardening. He grows vegetables, and I grow flowers. And since he lives alone, all summer long he's giving me tomatoes, cucumbers, zucchini, and other scrumptious vegetables from his backyard plot. I've offered him cut flowers from my beds in return, but he says he's just as happy looking at their beauty from over the small fence between our 2 yards. I waved at him with my free hand and pushed open my front door. "Have a good evening," I said. "Thank you, dear, and you do the same. Don't spend it all with your nose to the grindstone." I closed the door behind me and wished I didn't have to work again tonight. After changing into comfy clothing, I grabbed the TV remote to turn on the local news, and then pulled some of Mr. Wendell's veggies from the fridge to throw together a quick stir-fry. Through the onion and zucchini, I was deep in thought about the files I had to tackle later. But in the middle of slicing the carrots, a news story drew my attention toward the flat-screen TV in my living room. I stilled my knife and watched a reporter standing on the edge of a field of wildflowers that was surrounded with yellow crime scene tape. She was reporting live. "Around 11 o'clock this morning, an adult male suspect is accused of kidnapping 9-year-old Anna Smith from these fields behind her home." A photo of a little girl with long, dark, curly hair and an angelic smile flashed onto the TV screen. The reporter then pointed toward a cluster of trees near the field and said, "Police have traced male boot prints coming out of that stand of trees toward a spot in this field of wildflowers where the abduction is believed to have occurred." A phone number scrolled across the bottom of the screen as the reporter continued. "So far, none of the neighbors has reported seeing anyone or anything unusual in the area. If you have any information that can help police, please contact them at the number you see on your screen." I picked up the remote, muted the news, and began to simultaneously hyperventilate and break out into a sweat. Dropping my knife onto the counter, I sucked in one deep breath after another as images from a childhood memory played like a movie across my mind. I had thought of this memory many times throughout my life, but before today it had always ended with my sitting in the lap of a stranger while he read a children's book to me in the back seat of his car. Now the memory was expanding and I saw it all. The blanket, the darkness, the pressure, the terror, the threats. I crumpled onto the floor and clutched my stomach, rocking back and forth and sobbing uncontrollably. Vivid images flooded my mind and sent pulsing shots of adrenaline through my entire body. The rawness of the images pushed my present reality far into the background. So at first I didn't hear the knocking at the door. But it persisted and got louder and then louder still. Loud enough to finally shake me loose from the memory's grip and land me back in my kitchen. I looked down at myself. The top of my t-shirt was soaked with tears, and I was a mess. I rubbed my wet face with my hands and glanced at the front door, where someone was still knocking loudly. Through the frosted window glass, I could see the physique of Mr. Wendell, and I knew if I didn't answer, he would continue making that awful racket. Pulling myself up to a standing position, I smoothed out my shirt and my hair, tried to rub any mascara from below my eyes, and then reluctantly unlocked and opened my front door. Mr. Wendell dropped the hand he'd been pounding with and looked at me with impassioned eyes and deeply furrowed brows. He may have been in his 80s, but his blue eyes still shone clear and strong, and at the moment they were practically burning a hole into my face. "Ava, are you all right?" I lowered my eyes. "Yes, Mr. Wendell, thank you. I'll be fine." With his salt and pepper-colored eyebrows raised in disbelief, he said, "You didn't sound so fine from what I was hearing a few moments ago." I wasn't ready to talk about what I'd just experienced, so I told him, "I had some bad news, but I'll be fine." He tilted his head, his eyes still trained on my face as if he didn't quite believe me. "Is there anything you want to talk about?" "Thank you for caring," I said honestly. "Really, I'm good." For a few seconds he just stood there, looking down at the porch, and then at me, and then at the porch again. He finally said hesitantly, "Well, if there is anything at all I can do for you, please knock on my door." And then he added, "You promise you'll be all right?" I forced a smile and assured him I would be okay. As he left, I closed and locked the door and then leaned against the wall beside the entryway. I had several thoughts pulling at me at once. First, my insides felt like they'd been run through a paper shredder, and I was suddenly exhausted. Second, there was no way I was up to doing office work this evening, and nothing this side of the Mississippi River was going to change that. Third, I'd lost my appetite, and even Mr. Wendell's fresh veggies wouldn't bring it back. I pulled away from the wall, forced myself to put the veggies in the fridge, and headed to bed. Everything would have to wait until tomorrow. In the morning, there was still a big lead weight in my stomach. Somehow I managed to get up and drag myself to the coffee maker in the kitchen. Staring numbly at the dark liquid streaming into my mug, I considered taking a sick day, but I decided work might help me manage the disturbing images that kept flashing through my mind. As I picked up my coffee cup, I willed the images into a mental folder until I could figure out what to do with them. I always showed up early for work so I could chat for a few minutes with my closest friend and coworker, Jamie Ross. But today, I was 5 minutes late. My boss, Mr. Donovan, never arrived before 10 at the earliest, so he would never know about those lost 5 minutes. And he was the one always piling on the extra work I did each evening. Those 5 late minutes were nothing compared to all the hours I'd already given to the cause. Jamie leaned against the frame of my cubicle and said, "Good morning, Ava." "Hi," I said with a thick voice that came out sounding like a baritone horn instead of like me. "Oh, sounds like you had a rough night." I nodded and cleared my throat. "You could say that. And I didn't get the folders done that Mr. Donovan gave me to do last evening, so I'll really have to push it today." Jamie's eyes grew big and her mouth dropped open in surprise. "The most conscientious worker in the entire company didn't get her take-home work done. What happened? Did your house burn down? Did Mr. Wendell die?" I smiled at her exaggerated images. "None of the above." "Are you sick? Your throat doesn't sound so great," she said. "No, I'm fine. I stopped and considered telling her about the memory, but talking about it would take too much time out of my workday. And anyway, I had begun to wonder whether the memory was real, or if I was just feeling sorry for the little girl in the news story. Maybe I was mixing her story with my own. Jamie roused me from my thoughts. Hello, Ava. You just what?" To placate her, I said, "I'll tell you at some point, but I have to get to work. I have a meeting about the company's new hires at 10, and Mr. Donovan wants these files on his desk by noon. So I really have to put my nose to the grindstone." Jamie smiled and said, "Mr. Wendell phraseology strikes again. Yeah, well, sometimes a grindstone against my face is the right image." Folding her arms across her chest, Jamie said, "You know you can do something about that. You say the word and we'll walk into Mrs. Green's office and tell her how your lazy boss uses you to do the work he should be doing." I rolled my eyes and said, "Here we go again." "Ava," she started, and I knew she was about to launch into her usual rant. "For the 100th time, it's not right that you're taking his work home so he can play. He doesn't even come in until 10 or 11 in the morning, and he goes golfing 3 or 4 times a week. And when he does make an appearance here at the office, he spends half the day talking on his phone with his golf buddies." I did not want to have this conversation again. Not today. I looked at her and said, "I heard you, Jamie. Now I need to get to work." Unfolding her arms and pinching her lips together in frustration, she turned to go without saying a word. "Don't go away mad," I said. She stopped and turned back, and her lips smiled, but her eyes were serious. "I'm not mad. I just hate that he uses you, and I don't understand why you won't do anything about it." "I can't risk getting fired," I said with exasperation. Before Jamie could continue with her "you won't get fired" speech, the one where she tells me I have enough grievances to get him fired and not the other way around, I said, "Look, you're married and you have a husband and kids, so of course you can't take work home with you. I'm single and I have no excuse. I have no valid reason to say no." Throwing her hands into the air, Jamie said, "Ava, listen to yourself. You love your garden. You love to take cooking classes. You love to jog. You have every right to have a life like everyone else. He's not going to fire you. Why can't you just say no to him?" I had no idea why saying no was so hard for me, so I just shrugged and said, "I don't know." Jamie looked at me like she was processing my response, and then flashed me a conciliatory smile. "Well, that's the first time you've ever admitted you can't say no. That's progress." She pushed off the cubicle wall where she'd been leaning and moved into the aisle. "Okay, I know you need to get to work. I'll see you at lunch and we'll talk more." I watched her walk away. Even if Jamie's blunt honesty was sometimes aggravating, she was a true friend. I turned and put my nose to Mr. Wendell's proverbial grindstone. All day long the memory tried to walk itself out of the mental drawer where I'd filed it, but I kept putting it back and did everything I could to work harder and faster. At lunch, Jamie tried to bring it up, but I jokingly told her to talk to the hand I was holding in front of her face. She got the message and dropped the subject. I was so glad it was Friday. The online weather report was predicting a sunny Saturday in the mid-70s, and I was looking forward to weeding my flower beds, which I hadn't done for more than a week. I loved the therapy of gardening. The images were there again. First the wildflowers in the news story, and then the car, and the stranger, and the blanket, and the darkness. I glanced at the clock on my computer and shoved the images back in their file. Only 2 more hours. I could make it that far, and then it was the weekend. If all went well, I'd be completely caught up by the end of the day, and my weekend would be work-free. I was focused on the information I was entering into my computer, so I never noticed Mr. Donovan approaching me from behind. He cleared his throat. I jumped in surprise and turned my head to see him standing next to my cubicle. "Hello, Ava. I didn't mean to scare you." "Hello, Mr. Donovan." I noticed the folders in his hand. "I'd like you to quantify the information in these folders for a meeting I have on Monday at noon. Please have the report on my desk by 10 a.m. on Monday." Whenever Mr. Donovan asked me to do something, I always felt anxiety pump through my whole body. It was no different this time. Worry started filling my chest with pressure, and then it rose higher to smother my brain. I was freaking out again. He was still holding the folders, waiting for me to take them. Even though I was in a panic, I forced myself to try and say no. Mr. Donovan, I won't be able to finish that before I leave today, and there's probably not enough time on Monday before your meeting to get it done." He looked annoyed at my feeble protest and shrugged his shoulders as if the solution was obvious. "Well then, Ava, I guess you'll just have to take it home over the weekend, won't you?" "Sure, Mr. Donovan, I'll do that. I'll have it on your desk by 10 on Monday." I took the folders from his hand. He turned and walked away and called back over his shoulder, "Have a good weekend." Ugh! I was so upset at myself. Jamie was right. I couldn't say no. I shook my head in disgust and opened the folders to see how much work I'd just agreed to do. It looked like I could knock it out in 4 or 5 hours. Even though I felt gross about the way I'd handled things, it was a small consolation to know I would still have some free time over the weekend. On the way home from work, I stopped and ordered takeout from the Mexican food truck near the plaza. I decided on the spur of the moment to order a second meal for Mr. Wendell. I'd never done that before, but I needed a distraction, and I knew I could easily get Mr. Wendell to chat about gardening. When I got home, he was sitting in his rocking chair, smiling at me and holding up 2 glasses of his homemade lemonade. I laughed and held up my 2 bags of takeout. "We're on the same page, Mr. Wendell. I brought takeout for both of us. Do you like chicken tacos?" He set the lemonade glasses on the little table between his 2 porch rockers. "When it comes to food, I love almost anything," he said enthusiastically. "Chicken tacos will do just fine." I took my things inside and grabbed plates for both of us. We sat in his rockers and ate and talked about the blight that was hitting his tomato plants and about our weekend gardening plans. As we were finishing up, he looked at me with his blue eyes and bushy eyebrows. "Ava, how are you doing with the bad news you received last evening?" I didn't want to lie to him, so I corrected what I had told him. It wasn't bad news. I hesitated and wondered how to tell him the truth without telling him everything. Mr. Wendell, I was feeling really sad about something I remembered, that's all. Mr. Wendell never spoke until he was ready to say something. I liked that about him, and I was used to quiet spaces in our conversations. So when he nodded and said nothing, I just waited. I think I even hoped he might have some sage words to say that would chase away the sadness that kept creeping into my thoughts. After a while, he looked at me and said simply, "Why don't you tell me about it? It's Friday, so you can wait to tackle those folders you brought home, and I'm not going anywhere, so there's no hurry for either of us." I answered him truthfully, "Thanks, Mr. Wendell, but it's pretty personal." He thought for a few seconds and said with a smile, "I understand most of what we experience is personal." I grinned back at him until tears came up from out of nowhere and started spilling down my cheeks, and I sat there trying to fight them into submission. Sage Mr. Wendell said, "It does a soul good to let some of that sadness come out through tears. That's why God made them." I knew Mr. Wendell believed in Jesus and God, but he wasn't religious like the people who attended the church up the street. Those people told me if I didn't accept Jesus, I was going to hell. I knew I was bad enough to go to hell, so it wasn't their words that bothered me. They just didn't seem like happy people, and their God didn't seem very happy either. But Mr. Wendell, he was one of the nicest people I knew, and his kindness was as steady as they come. His version of God was a lot like him, or maybe it was the other way around. We sat in silence again. By now the memory had surfaced and taken charge of me again. Though it wasn't ripping apart my insides this time, no matter how I tried, I couldn't seem to stuff it back in its file. Mr. Wendell handed me clean napkins from his takeout bag, and I used them to wipe away the tears that wouldn't stop flowing. And then for some reason I just started spilling everything to him. I told him the entire memory, and that I'd only ever recalled the first part of it, until yesterday when I'd seen the news report about the little girl. When I finished, I asked, "Why am I just remembering it all now? Or am I making it all up?" He rocked and quietly pondered. After a few minutes, he looked my way and said, "I'm no counselor, but I think that memory was there on the inside of you, and the news story brought it to the surface." I couldn't speak because of a lump that was forming in my throat, so I just nodded until I was finally able to say, "That's what I think too." I felt bad for being such a downer. "I'm sorry for telling you all this," I said apologetically. His response was instant. "Ava, we all have a story that needs to be told." I forced a smile. "Thank you, Mr. Wendell. You're very kind." And then I wondered about his story. "You have a story too?" He nodded, and his eyes focused on a spot on the porch, while his thoughts roamed toward his story. Folding a napkin absent-mindedly, he said, "Growing up, I had a brother who was 7 years my senior, and for some reason, he took a disliking to my existence. So whenever our father wasn't around, he beat me up, and then threatened to do even worse things to me if I ever told anyone." Mr. Wendell raised his eyes and turned them toward me. I took his regular beatings and wondered what was wrong with me that made me deserve them. When I grew older, Jesus showed me I was just a child, and children aren't able to reason, so they often assume the bad things that happen are their fault. But that couldn't have been further from the truth. It wasn't my fault. I sat listening. I wanted to ask Mr. Wendell where his Jesus was when his brother was beating him up. But that seemed far too personal. So instead I said, Jamie says I let my boss walk all over me. You know, with all the folders he gives me to bring home. She doesn't understand why I can't say no to him. In that usual way of his, Mr. Wendell said nothing for a while. When he was ready to speak, he tilted his head and met my eyes with a pensive gaze. When was the first time you stopped being able to say no to people? I thought that was an odd question, but I shrugged and answered him. I have no clue. I think I've always felt like I can't say no to people. Even as I said it, I felt guilty for being such a wimp. He sat front, put down the glass of lemonade in his hand, and said gently, maybe it was when little Ava couldn't say no to her perpetrator because he was bigger than she was. His words caught me completely by surprise, and I choked on the lump that had returned to my throat. He was absolutely right. That was the day I learned it was impossible to say no. I felt so humiliated for crying in front of Mr. Wendell, but he just kept saying, "It's all right. Let it out. You'll feel so much better." When things calmed down after a minute or two, I avoided looking at him. We sat in silence. I noticed I did feel a little better, just as Mr. Wendell had promised. I finally glanced in his direction. The softest eyes were looking back at me. I wanted to ask him the question I'd thought of earlier, except, in all honesty, it had never been about Mr. Wendell's brother. I really wanted to know the answer for my own story. I looked over at him and asked, "Where was Jesus when that man harmed me?" This time, Mr. Wendell's silent space stretched out and laid there for a while, like a sleeping dog tuckered out by a hard run. The longer he sat with his eyes closed, the more intense his facial expression became, until finally he opened his eyes and his mouth and released all the earnestness that had built up inside. He said to me, "Jesus was shouting loudly, telling that man not to do what he was intending, pleading with him to stop. He was shouting it over and over again." Once again, Mr. Wendell's answer had caught me by surprise. I had only one response, which I asked almost too softly to be heard. "Then why didn't the man stop?" He answered me with the same earnestness as before. "Because God gives us humans the freedom to choose whether or not we'll listen to him." More tears came, and I didn't try to stop them. If Jesus was anything like Mr. Wendell made him out to be, I knew he would have done exactly what Mr. Wendell described. He would have shouted loudly at that stranger to stop. "He can make it up to you, Ava," Mr. Wendell said. "Jesus can heal that little girl's pain." I nodded at my neighbor but said nothing. I think he knew I'd had enough of heavy topics for one day because he changed the subject. "Thank you so much for the tacos. They were absolutely delicious. And the next takeout dinner on the porch is on me." I smiled a tired smile. "Okay, Mr. Wendell, you place the order and I'll pick it up." "You place the order and I'll pick it up." "Now don't go thinking I'm feeble just because I'm old," he chided. "I know how to have food delivered right to my doorstep." He grinned and then got serious again and focused on me with his strong blue eyes. "You're a good person, Ava. It's time you believed in yourself." "Thank you, Mr. Wendell. Coming from you, that means a lot." My weekend went much better than expected. I even had time for some flower bed therapy. And in case he was as kind as Mr. Wendell had portrayed him to be, I said a prayer to his Jesus to ask for help with Mr. Donovan. On Monday morning, I put the folders on my boss's desk and then went to my cubicle and sat down. I was only there for a minute when I heard, "Good morning, Ava." Jamie was rounding the corner for our usual morning hellos. "Hi," I said cheerfully. "Well, it sounds like you had a good weekend," she said. "Yeah, I did. How was yours?" She sighed. "I was running back and forth between Brad's baseball tournament and the kids' soccer practices for most of the weekend." "Sounds fun?" I said, more like a question than a statement. "It was," Jamie said. "Just busy." Changing the subject, I said, "So I might need your help today." "For what?" she responded curiously. I told her my plan and that I couldn't do it without her. When she heard what I was up to, she said way too loudly, "I am so proud of you." I looked around and said, "Shh." "Oh, sorry, that was a little loud, wasn't it?" She hugged me. "But really, I'm proud of you." I waited on pins and needles all day long and forced myself to focus on work. I was especially vigilant for the moment when Mr. Donovan approached my cubicle. At 3:45, I saw him walk out of his office. He was carrying folders in his hands and heading in my direction. I stood up and looked for Jamie. She'd seen him too and was walking toward me. They both arrived at my cubicle at the same time. Mr. Donovan looked a bit surprised to see Jamie standing there, but continued with his usual, "Hello, Ava." I could feel myself starting to panic as the pressure in my chest and head mounted. But knowing Jamie was nearby and that I didn't have to do it on my own helped me stay in the moment. "Hello, Mr. Donovan. How was your weekend?" I asked. I didn't usually ask him about his life, so he sputtered a little when he answered, "Well, it was good. How was yours?" My heart was thumping in my chest, but I answered, "It was good. Thanks for asking." He got down to business. Holding the folders out to me, he said, "Ava, I'd like you to look at these stats, analyze the employee turnover rates for the company, and make a graph that shows the current trends. Please put it on my desk in the morning." I so wanted to get this conversation right. Jamie had coached me, but with all the internal synapses and nerves that were misfiring at the moment, I was having trouble remembering what to say. I forged ahead anyway. "Mr. Donovan, I can do this for you during work hours, but I won't be able to take any work home with me this evening, or any other evening, from now on." I looked at Jamie, and she smiled and gave me a nod of affirmation. With that same annoyance that showed up whenever I tried to confront him, Mr. Donovan said, "If you can't do the work, Ava, then I'll need to hire someone who can." My internal panic increased, and I looked at Jamie at a loss for words. I couldn't afford to get fired. With an edge to her voice, Jamie spoke up. "Mr. Donovan, when is the last time you took work home with you in the evening? And why in the world would you assume Ava should take work home with her every evening? She said she can do the work, but to ask her to take it home is just not fair to her." With his habitual annoyance written all over his face, he turned to Jamie and said, "This has nothing to do with you, Jamie. I'm talking to Ava." He turned back to me and said, "Do what I've asked or find another place to work." He stood there holding out the folders, expecting me to take them. This wasn't going as I'd hoped. All my senses were on overload, and I was melting down inside. Jamie would have none of it. She crossed her arms like she always does when she's putting on her challenge hat, and said loudly enough for people in cubicles around us to hear, "Well, maybe we need to talk to Mrs. Green and file a grievance that lets her know how often you ask Ava to take your work home, and how often you come in late in the mornings, and how many times you go golfing during the week, and how long you're on personal phone calls when you're here at the office. She might be interested in those details about your work habits." Mr. Donovan's face blanched white, and I'm sure if he'd been a cartoon character, steam would have been coming out of his ears. He looked at Jamie and then at me and turned abruptly, taking the folders along with him as he left. Through the glass walls of his office, we watched as he sat down at his desk, opened the folders, and began to study their contents. He started working. I was still worried that Jamie had just gotten both of us fired, until 3 other people stood up from nearby cubicles and quietly applauded her. Then they started talking over each other, pouring out their own accounts of how Mr. Donovan had tried to overload them with work. They were all miffed at his lazy bones. Jamie looked around at our co-workers and said to me, "See, you're not the only one with grievances. There's no way Mrs. Green will let you get fired because your complaints are justified." She used her chin to point at Mr. Donovan and said, "And he knows you're in the right." On the way home, I thought about Mr. Wendell. I couldn't wait to tell him about Jamie's boldness and about the grievances that 4 of us had filed with Mrs. Green. He was sitting on the porch as I pulled into my driveway. I walked up the stairs and looked up to see him holding 2 takeout containers. "Hello, Ava. Dinner's waiting." Before I could respond, he cocked his head and said to me, "No folders this evening." "Mr. Wendell, you're not going to believe what happened today." We sat down, and while we ate, I told him about Mr. Donovan and the reason I had no folders with me. By the time I'd finished sharing, he was smiling from ear to ear. He held up his glass of signature lemonade in a toast to me. "Ava, I couldn't be more proud of you." "It wasn't me," I protested. "It was all Jamie. If she hadn't been there, I would be doing Mr. Donovan's work again this evening." Mr. Wendell lowered his glass and leaned toward me, his eyes glowing with a sort of grandfatherly pride. "But you asked for help." I hesitated for a few seconds and then said self-consciously, "I also asked your Jesus for help." His eyebrows shot up like he was both surprised and pleased. "You did?" I nodded. While I was weeding on Saturday, I said a prayer to him. Mr. Wendell sat back and rocked and said, "Jesus is wise. He knew you would need to lean on Jamie's boldness until you can learn to say no for yourself." I hadn't thought about Jamie's fearlessness being an answer to my prayer. I looked over at my sage neighbor. "You're pretty wise too, Mr. Wendell." He smiled and rocked and contemplated for a while and then turned again toward me. "Ava, I know you think Jesus is just for me, but he's for everyone, including you." I watched my neighbor's eyes fill with kindness, while my eyes strangely filled with tears. I'd never before considered the possibility that Jesus would be for me like he is for Mr. Wendell. I turned to him and said truthfully, "I think I would like that." "He would like it too," Mr. Wendell answered confidently. Suddenly, I felt shy, so I closed my eyes. Talking quietly to Mr. Wendell's Jesus, I told him I would like to know him the way Mr. Wendell knew him, and then thanked him for giving me such a good neighbor. I shot a glance at the old man. His eyes were closed, and his face was enveloped in a smile. I shut my eyes again and drank in the calm that was filling the silent space on the porch. And somehow, I knew Mr. Wendell's Jesus was already beginning to answer me. Thank you so much for listening. I trust you enjoyed this story. Of course, I'm always interested in what you have to say about it, so please leave a comment below. And join me next week when I share about today's story, where the idea came from, how it applies to life, and how it builds hope, etc. Also, in the description below, you will find a link to the written form of today's story, as well as information about my allegorical novel and other books I've written. And finally, as you can imagine, it does take time to write, edit, and record these stories. If you enjoy them, please consider supporting their creation with a one-time thanks. I will see you next week, and until then, I hope you have a great week.